fashioning a theoretical tool that people actually want to use. That I like. Because the fashioning of, and that you like. For you to be this 8 hours deep into the lecture series, you have to be the type of person that wants that. So for me, it's the power for me is in having the ability to construct a tool that those who really occupy that position can pick up and use. So that the idea is they already got poli-sci info. They know that. They already got IR info. They know that. They already got conflict resolution, maybe to a lesser extent. Conflict resolution, they sort of know that. Wait a second, you're going to use risk assessment from a business standpoint and incorporate that? And we're not talking about the protection of money, we're just talking, yeah, that's exactly the point. Why? Because there is a structure that has been undeniably demonstrated as being empirically verifiable. We're talking about people's money. So what better way to incorporate and hybridize in terms of new theory, in terms of governance, the relationship between knowledge and risk, than by associating knowledge and risk and building on the structure that already adheres functionally well within capital, obviously, within capital, having to do with sort of risk management, diversification, risk assessment, blah, 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 in terms of money. Looking at and distilling the conceptual frameworks within that paradigm down to its seminal concepts and then borrowing those seminal concepts and appropriating those seminal concepts specifically to NSA. That's, you know, like I said, I don't like giving away my goodies, but that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm going to do. So that's 1A. That's one. Now 1A. Those seeking to make contributions to the field in terms of developing, first acknowledging the very real existence of threat and terrorism, must themselves be firmly steeped in the tradition and the discourse and power. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time, and let's jump to page 12, though I'm still going to talk about this discourse just briefly. I don't have time to get into, I mean, the discourse on power with respect to Nietzsche is 60 plus hours, consecutive hours on just that. And that's just what I presented from one half of one book. One half of one book that you can read probably in 3 to 4 days, right? It's not Nietzsche is not a difficult read at all. It's one half of one book. But there's 60 hours worth of explanation of one half of one book that you can read in 4 days. That's how deep this discourse on power is. So let me just give you a really brief conceptual overview. This is really now more for the community than myself, because obviously I know this already, but just so that you understand the idea of governance. Now, in terms of governance, you want to think of governance in relation to what's quote-unquote called the top. And then we have the bottom. So anytime you hear top-down assumes, and this might be almost too general, but I want to make sure I give a good account. This is sort of ghetto philosophy time, right? When we talk about a top-down approach, we're talking about hierarchically the recognition of those within sovereignty making accommodations, making recognition of what have you, any number of variables from those sort of at the bottom, which is we the people. Now, the assumption is that the governance is a condition of we the people, right? This is sort of poli-sci 101, right? What the mode in which government, M-E-N-T, function is to govern the people, but it's really the people governing themselves. And there's this elaborate method in which, and I'm not going to get into all of this because I'm really not interested in this, but just sort of a quick recap. We the people elect individuals to positions of authority who represent and govern on our behalf. So theoretically, it's supposed to look like this, but we recognize it really doesn't look like this. Even in the best state of affairs, it doesn't look like this, right? This is a theoretical, we posit this theoretically as one end of the polemic. The other end of the polemic is this, strictly top-down. Strictly top-down, right? Where you have a totalitarian, authoritarian, fascist state, and the mode of existence is complete dominance of the people. So in terms of power, you can talk about one aspect of power being top-down, or you can talk about another aspect of power being dialectic. There really isn't a a sense in which, in terms of national security affairs per se, you could, but there really isn't a sense in which you should begin the analysis with a bottom-up. What you want to do, theoretically speaking, and this is just my opinion, if you have the inclination to talk about a bottom-up, which many people do, have an inclination to want to talk about sort of bottom-up, it's more transformative, you have to recognize, right? Bottom-up approach is always a this is important, so put a star by this, right? And I'm giving away all the goodies now, because it doesn't really matter. But a bottom-up approach is always a transformative approach. If you want to talk about transformative justice, bottom-up approach in terms of transformative justice assumes an inherency wherein the function, the governance of justice is failing. Justice is failing people for any number of reasons, and transformative justice seeks to make amends for that perceived violation, if you will. In terms of grassroots movements, grassroots community organization and development, all of that is a bottom-up approach. But none of that grassroots community organization, development, progression, what have you, has any significance at all, without a recognition of top-down, or at least dialectical relationship. So the idea is, conceptually speaking, you cannot begin, sort of sequentially, a theoretical analysis. You really can't begin a theoretical analysis that begins with a bottom-up approach, because the bottom presupposes that there are things existing within orthodoxy, so that this would be orthodoxy, or the status quo, or even less, the mainstream. I don't really like that word. But all the same idea, in opposition to, right, in a force relation, in a systemically, in a systemic way in which power is directed downward. I'm not going to go into hegemony and all this. I could actually, now I think about it, I don't think I have a lecture series on power. Just power proper. I mean, I did will to power, but sort of like the idea of homogenized power, the role of hegemony. I haven't done any of that discourse, now that I think about it. Because I'm starting to think, I'm like, holy crap, there's a lot here that I could sort of explain more. But I can't, even this, I think, is not doing it service. I just want to give a brief conceptual sort of grounding. And now I'm thinking I might maybe next year do a bona fide sort of, not will to power, but just power. Sort of the conditions for power. Anywho, so this is always in opposition to what's known as the heterodoxy. Or heterodoxy, right? The heterodox are those who are defined by the constructs of power. Those who are delimited, segmented, alienated by the constructs of power. This is heterodox. Those who are marginalized. So then people will see, like I go on Facebook and I put some bizarre stuff having to do with heterodoxy, and people believe that I'm talking about occultism. Occultism is an aspect of heterodoxy, but occultism isn't heterodoxy. Anything that isn't mainstream, this is a bit sort of the easy, dull way of recognizing it, just so that everybody else understands, because I definitely understand. I think a lot of people are confused, terribly confused. Heterodoxy is just anything that's not mainstream. There was a time when I came up as a young boy that hip-hop was absolutely heterodox. And I came up under the heterodox era of, forget the golden age era. Like if I was to do philosophy of hip-hop book proper, I would label it as the heterodox era of hip-hop. I came up with that era. When Ice Cube wasn't doing all the nice, happy stuff that he was doing, and America was scared of him because he was the guy that did Fuck the Police. And he did a great verse. It's one of the greatest verses, individual verses in hip-hop ever. Right? So hip-hop, I came up when hip-hop was aggressive and people were really, really, honestly, genuinely scared of the community. And anybody who was affiliated with the community. It wasn't sort of this bubblegum, sort of poppy hip-hop that it is now. It was like people were fatigued out, were all black, not because it was the cool thing to do. It's because the representation was really for and from a community of people that were doing exactly the same thing. Heterodox. We're not mainstream. We're not like you, and we don't want to be like you. Right? That's, properly speaking, heterodox. But you can see that there's going to be an inherent need to dominate, to control those who assume such a position.